and welcome. The show is Policy Watch and I'm Athar Khan. Before I introduce my guest this week, a quick look at this week's top headlines. Economic growth slips again. India grows at a dismal 5.3% in the quarter ending March. Overall GDP growth for the year at 6.5%. Core sector growth off to a sluggish start as India's infrastructure sectors grew at just 2.2% in the April period. The Cabinet approves the national telecom policy, consumers to benefit as roaming charges set to be abolished. Some relief for foreign investors as Pranab Mukherjee says tax cases assessed in the last financial year will not be reopened. Those were the headlines, and here in the studio this week, my guest is KG Narendranath, Deputy Editor of the Financial Express. This is your first time on the show. A very warm welcome, sir. Without any further ado, let's jump into our first story this week. Now, India continues to suffer a slowdown in growth, with the economy growing at a dismal 5.3% in the quarter ending March 2012. The rate of growth was lower than the expected 6.1% as predicted by economists. This means that India's growth rate has slowed down for 8 successive quarters. The overall GDP growth for the year stood at 6.5%, less than the projection of 6.9% projected by the Reserve Bank of India, and well below the 8.4% growth achieved last year. Here's a report, take a look.
A poor performance by the manufacturing and farm sectors led to India's slowest growth rate in almost 9 years, as the fourth quarter growth was pegged at 5.3%. According to the data released by the government on Thursday, growth in the manufacturing sector slowed down to 0.3%, down from 7.3% in the corresponding period last year. Farm output expanded just 1.7% during the Jan-March quarter as compared to 7.5% in 2010-11. Mining was the lone bright spot, with production growing by 4.3% compared to a meager 0.6% in the fourth quarter of 2010-11. Growth in the construction sector slowed to 4.8%, down from 8.9% last year. The services sector stood firm, growing at 10%, the same as last year. Growth in the country has suffered a major blow, with the economy having to contend with the global slowdown, especially the crisis in the Eurozone, affecting sentiment as well. A constantly weakening rupee coupled with increased policy inaction by the government has affected growth as well. With the government unable to rein in a ballooning fiscal deficit, this is India's slowest rate of growth in almost 9 years. High inflation stoked by monetary tightening as well as the falling rupee has compounded the problems for not just the government but the consumers as well. Yet another consequence of high inflation will be the RBI's inability to cut interest rates further. The central bank recently cut the benchmark repo rate by 50 basis points, but has warned of a limited scope of action in the days to come. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
There you go. KG Narendranath, let me ask you this. Manufacturing and farm sectors have played spoilers this time around, with manufacturing growing at just 0.3% and farm at around 1.7%. Did you expect such a dismal performance in this quarter, or is it just a reiteration of the trends we've been seeing in the past couple of months?
This is a reiteration of the trend, but nobody expected the growth to be so low, because everybody is expecting growth to be slower than, actually I expected a slower growth than most people expected. But still it was a surprise to everybody. The point, as you mentioned, agricultural growth has more or less plateaued, because unless there is a major productivity breakthrough, we cannot improve our agricultural production now, growth now. Because last year's the 7% growth was because of the previous year's flat growth.
Right.
So this 2.5% growth in agriculture, 2.8% growth in agriculture is more or less what we can achieve. We cannot grow more than this unless there is a major productivity improvement, for which we need major technologies, seed technology, and fertilizer consumption pattern change, and also the downstream value addition in the retail chain, for which retail FD is also important.
Right.
But in the case of manufacturing, there is scope for improvement. That is where we actually need some reforms to be undertaken immediately, so that in the manufacturing sector, our growth is quite dismal now. Mainly because of the manufacturing growth decline. This quarter's growth has been negative in manufacturing, and the overall year's growth was 2.5%.
And manufacturing is what's been driving India's growth story for the past 3-4 years, isn't it?
Not exactly. Services have been driving.
Services
and manufacturing. But services, even now, we are growing at the same rate last year. So services are not actually underperformed if you consider the global situation. Considering the global situation, services have done better actually. So the scope is there for manufacturing to improve. For that, we need drastic reforms. And also, the investment climate should improve.
Right.
Rather than reforms, the investment climate should improve. The bureaucracy should come down.
Right.
That should be the emphasis.
It's interesting that you mentioned reforms. Let's talk about, by and large, KG Narendranath, the blame for this dismal performance has been coming at the door of New Delhi and the central government, saying the alleged inaction or the policy paralysis is a word that people like to bandy about these days. But largely the blame has come on the central government, saying that because of the alleged inaction, because of the lack of reforms that the government has been unable to push through or usher in. Would you agree with that? Is the government largely to blame because they couldn't push the reforms they had promised?
Actually, it's both at the center and the state level. Because of lack of political consensus, the opposition ruled states, they don't actually go by even what the center says. If you take, for example, GST, there's a major reform pending for quite some time. Because of lack of consensus among states, the BJP ruled states are not actually in line with the central government stance. And the central government is actually trying to push that reform. It's not that it is lacking there. But because of lack of political consensus, and different states have different points of view, they just look at the short-term revenue interest and political partisanship. If that has to change, actually, it is wrong to blame only the central government for the policy paralysis.
So that's what I wanted to ask. Largely blaming the government is not really the way. The other people other stakeholders are also to blame.
Yes.
Let's talk about something else.
And of course, the external situation. External situation is also to blame.
Yeah, external factors have played a big role. We'll talk about external factors in just a bit, but I want to ask you this before I go to the external factors. There's a trend that this is a slowdown on the consumption side. Investment demand had already been going down, but because now there's a pronounced slowdown, if I could call it, in consumption as well. Given the fact that there is this pronounced slowdown on the consumption side, things are not really looking good for India in the near future, are they? Some people say India has hit rock bottom. Do you agree with that?
Actually, things are not really looking good for India. Next year's growth can be even less than this year's growth. If it is 6.5% in 2011-12, next year it can be even below 6%. Because the economy has already reached its productive capacity. So the investment growth, as you mentioned, is declining. Quarter on quarter, there is a decline. The last quarter, there is some improvement in the investment situation. But generally, we see a decline if you see over a period of time, last 2 years. And there is a big gap emerging between the savings rate and investment rate.
Right.
Which actually reflect the current account deficit.
The savings rate is not that bad, some people would say.
It is 32%, around 32%. The latest data we don't have, 2011 data we have is around 32%. It's not that bad, but again, there's signs of it dipping further.
Right.
Because people are looking at other saving instruments rather than financial savings. So that is very evident. And this widening gap is also a problem. So investment decline, gross capital formation, fixed capital formation as percentage of GDP, you see a big decline if you see the latest data also.
Right.
So that is very worrisome actually.
You mentioned the current account deficit as well. Of course, it's a huge worry for the Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee and his team at North Block. He hasn't been able to really curb or rein in the current account deficit. Also, the rupee has been sliding, the worst slide in almost 10 years. Yeah. How far do you think has the rupee slide affected the slowdown in the economy? Some people would say it's not just the rupee, it's the CAD and the rupee and external factors clubbed together that has brought India where it is right now.
Yeah, the current account deficit mainly because our exports are not growing as fast as our imports. Because we have certain unavoidable imports like oil imports, where the global prices are actually contributing to increase in import bill.
And global food is out of India's hands.
Yeah, it's out of India. Fertilizer and various other sectors also. And gold imports, people have looked for gold as a safe haven. So safe haven investment. So there also the government can actually crack down and you can actually control gold imports, for example. Other imports may not be not easy to curb. But that's one reason, because our exports have been growing around 15% last year. But that is good, but it should have grown even faster. And there is need for our, because if you say the net exports to GDP, the contribution of net exports to GDP is negative even now because of the large imports. So exports should actually significantly play a role in contribution to GDP.
Staying on the current account deficit, sir, let me ask you this. It's the highest percentage since 1980, according to some figures. Now, in the absence of reining in the current account deficit, there is really no question of giving another stimulus to industry. The government cannot afford that. But if we can't give another stimulus to industry, how will we revive the economic growth? And do you see especially in the crisis, the global crisis happening as well. If we can't give a stimulus to our economy, how do we expect it to revive?
Because there is no scope for stimulus, as you said. There is no room for that. Because already we have a loose fiscal policy. We continue to have a loose fiscal policy. Because if at all we have to control the fiscal deficit, we have to attack the subsidies.
Exactly.
Other austerity measures, some reduction in the non-planned expenditure, they are very minimal. Actually, substantive reduction in fiscal deficit can happen only if you reorganize the subsidies and make it more effective and targeted.
Right.
For that, there is no political consensus. Actually, the government can do that now because the elections are some bit away.
Right.
And if the government actually bites a bullet and does it, that will help in curbing fiscal deficit.
That's a very interesting point that you raised. I'd like to talk about subsidy, but that's after a short break. Don't go anywhere. Lots more to talk about with KG Narendranath on the other side of this break. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch, and I'm still in conversation with KG Narendranath. So you talked about subsidies in a bit. I'll give you a double header of a question right now. One on subsidies. First, petrol hike just recently happened. Do you think that time has come for the government to bite the bullet on diesel because it can't afford giving out any more subsidies? That's part A. Part two of this story is do you see any chance, any possibility of India reviving growth, sustaining that high growth rate without stoking inflation at the same time?
Actually, for India to, Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee, in his statement yesterday, blamed the RBI's tight monetary policy for the slow growth. Actually, loose fiscal policy is also equally a reason for that. So unless the fiscal deficit is controlled, the RBI's any easing of monetary action would also serve the purpose. So it is very important to do the subsidy reform, and diesel is the most important one.
Right.
So government can actually decontrol diesel prices and make LPG prices or LPG subsidy targeted only at the poor people who actually really need it.
Right.
So that is where actually the government need to act now. Yeah.
And the second part of the question, do you think India can sustain a high growth rate given the fact that RBI will be taking action in its June 18th meeting?
I don't think if you take the short term, for the next 1 year or given the global situation and the situation which we are now in, even if you do some subsidiary reform, some major reform, generally including manufacturing sector reform, that can lead to some higher growth in the coming years. But immediately for the next 1 year, I think this situation is going to continue and the overall growth may be even less than 6% next year. Fair
point. So we'll go into our next story at this point. We'll talk about what the cabinet did just yesterday now. The cabinet on Thursday approved a new telecom policy that proposes to abolish roaming charges on mobile phones and allow users to retain the same number across the country. The National Telecom Policy 2012 aims to provide free roaming to telecom users and allow them to retain the mobile number even outside their circles without having to pay any extra charge. At present, users have to pay extra when they receive or make a call in a circle outside their home network. They are called roaming charges. Now, sir, Cabinet cleared this on Thursday, I think, yesterday now. Do you think it was long pending, the National Telecom Policy, especially given the fact the fiasco that we know, the fiasco that we know as the 2G spectrum? Do you think it's the right move, comes at the right time?
No, this is a long delayed policy. And it is actually only a statement of intent. Actually, the actual policy elements need to be implemented through a series of actions involving the regulator, the Telecom Commission, the government, and various other stakeholders, including the industry. So that is a other process which has to take place. These are only statements of intent. So these won't immediately translate into any investment revival or increased confidence in the industry, because the actual policy action now pending is that 2G reallocation.
Right. So that's the biggest issue.
That's the biggest issue. So there the reserve price, how feasible is that reserve price, how actually it's a huge burden on the industry or what, whether that cost on the spectrum pricing cost, whether that is actually manageable by the industry. So the players, it will actually lead to some decrease in the number of players also.
Right.
It is anticipated that the actual interest demand may not be as high as expected by the government. Because government assumptions are not actually based on market realities. There is some dichotomy there. Yeah.
You mentioned that it's just a statement of intent. It doesn't really solve the problems the telecom sector is facing, like say mergers and acquisitions, for example, or consolidation for that matter. Do you think that, say for example, it's dealing spectrum from licenses. Do you think, which used to come bundled earlier together now, do you think that's a good step, a step in the right direction? Do you think it'll help the telecom sector?
This is also a proposal.
It's
it
a
is
proposal.
going to come. Yeah. That is a good thing. A pan-India network where you can actually, interstate roaming will go. So inter-circle roaming will go. That's actually good for the consumer as well as the industry. But for the actual policy action needs to be done through the other. What is the spectrum pricing, how the spectrum is allocated, who all are going to bid, who will be allowed to bid, and how much is actually manageable, viable for the industry.
But the telecom sector, the telecom industry is up in arms against those TRAI recommendations that they come up with. The DOT hasn't given the reply to the EGOM. They haven't taken a decision yet. They'll probably meet sometime soon, I think next week or something they have to meet. But do you think the TRAI guidelines in its current form, it's got a lot of flack from telecom industry as well as the major players, Bharti, Vodafone, as well as Idea. But do you think the fact that the minimum reserve price is about 7 times higher than what it was last time around, that's going to hurt the telecom sector a lot?
I think it will hurt the telecom sector a bit because there need to be a more lenient approach on that.
That's just the minimum reserve price we're talking about. Other recommendations, for example, the big three, Vodafone, Idea and Bharti will have to pay more to own the spectrum they already own. Do you think that's slightly unfair to those companies?
No, one can say that, but no, on that, also look at the other round. The government has to be non-discriminatory in its approach. So from the industry's point of view, it may look okay, but from the government side, I don't think it's
Right. So other proposals in the NDP, the number portability and everything. Do you think that, of course, will help consumers, which might be under a bit of a shock in case tariffs are raised if those guidelines are?
Actually, there is already a tele-density growth. If you see a decline. Actually, it should be around 10 to 15 million people added to the tele-density every year. Now it's come down to around 6 to 7 million or something. So that means there is a need for further stimulus for this industry to grow, especially in the rural area, because there is a saturation at the urban level. So if the industry has to grow further, that has to come, the market potential is mainly in the rural areas. So for that, the policy is very important, a viable policy, a pragmatic policy, which actually takes care of the actual cost of the telecom players and doesn't lead to duplication of infrastructure creation. And although the facility for resale, which is now being allowed, will actually lead to more competition.
Do you think the NTP
resale of services? Do
you think the NTP that has just been cleared has the potential to be that policy that we need right now? Very briefly, if you could.
Yeah, the policy of all the right intentions, but how it translates into action. It will take,
that has to be seen.
That has to be seen.
Right. On that point, we take another break. We'll come back with the third story of the week. Don't go anywhere. Lots more to come with KG Narendranath. We'll come back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch. Now, some good news for foreign investors on the tax front. Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee in a statement said that Income Tax Department will not reopen cases where assessment proceedings have been completed before April 1, 2012. During this year's budget speech, Mukherjee had outlined a plan to amend the 1961 Income Tax Act with an intention to tax Vodafone Hutch-type deals that involved assets based in India. The amendments had to come into effect after the Finance Bill 2012 became law with presidential consent. The announcement will provide some relief for worried foreign investors who had earlier raised concerns about reopening old cases. The minister also announced the formation of an advisory group to look into the issues of transfer pricing. This is what Pranab Mukherjee had to say. Take a look.
CBDT has issued a policy circular to all the officers concerned that please do not reopen the cases which have been finalized by 1st April 2012.
There you go, Pranab Mukherjee, Finance Minister, saying his bit there. Sir, does this statement reflect Pranab Mukherjee trying to woo those investors who've been worried sick about there might be a witch hunt of sorts? He is trying to tell them, look, there is no witch hunt, we are not the bad guys, come back and it's all good.
Actually, more than this tax issue, Vodafone tax issue, what investors need is an assurance about the tax policy in the country and general investment climate has to improve. The bureaucracy should come down. You know the POSCO's case.
Yeah.
It has been pending for the last many years now and they are not able to invest in India. So the investment scenario has to actually improve. So this Vodafone case, actually government mismanaged it. It is right that government has a right to take the tax from the company because they are not paid tax anywhere.
And the assets are based in India.
Assets are based in India. So there the government has a point. The problem is that government does not manage it too well. It has not done at the right time and then it flip-flop. There was a flip-flop.
Right.
And then he was trying to explain it in a very different way.
Right.
No, that was the problem. Actually, nobody can question the government's right to go after that company.
Right, absolutely.
What we need is actually an increase in the tax to GDP ratio. Actually, it used to be around 12% some 3-4 years ago. And then it's again dropped a bit. So if you actually need to improve the tax collection, the economy has to grow at a higher rate.
Right.
And there should be moderate tax rates. And the tax reforms should take place so that the industry can flourish and government can get more revenue.
Right. Let's stay on this
one. Cases like this may not be the right idea for the government to increase tax revenue.
Staying on this statement of Pranab Mukherjee's 1 second, he obviously trying to reach out to investors saying that, look, there's no witch hunt here, but Vodafone doesn't really benefit from there because there are reports in the media that the government is issuing a fresh tax demand on the Vodafone case to that company probably in June.
Yeah.
Should we expect a round 2 of government versus Vodafone? Clearly the first round went to Vodafone.
Yeah, of course we can expect because the company is not easily going to budge because the amount involved is quite huge. So with the interest and penalty, it will come around 21,000 crore as per the latest estimate. So that's a huge money. And there are some other cases also like the Sub Miller case, that Sisa Goa case, and Sanofi. So these cases also government may go after because as they now said, April 1 cases which have been finalized before April 1, 2012 will not be taken up.
Right.
But these are not cases which are finalized in that sense. So these cases government will go after. So there won't be a witch hunt. There won't be going back to the previous cases. That is assurance the government has now given.
But is there a chance, sir, that even with Pranab Mukherjee reaching out to investors and saying, look, we're not the bad guys, come, this is not a tax haven, but come and invest. Do you think because cases like Sab Miller and cases like Vodafone and Hutch, the government will go after these companies? Do you think investor confidence and investor sentiment will be hurt in the coming future?
It can hurt the investor sentiment in the given scenario. The general scenario is not very good anyway. So in that scenario, it may hurt the investments a bit because actually the government wants to raise the revenue. It is not getting enough revenue because it has to fund the social sector schemes. The elections are coming. So it is not finding other resources. So that is why it is going after certain companies now and trying to raise some resources. Right. So it may, in the short run, can affect investment sentiment.
There's this statement that I read by Pranab Mukherjee was that the road to recovery is through tax and tax revenues. How far do you agree with the finance minister? If we're in a hole right now, we're stuck in a hole, do you think the road to recovery leads through tax revenues itself?
The road to recovery is not through tax revenue, but if there is recovery through other means, by reforms and other measures, that can lead to increased tax revenue, which will increase the government's capacity to spend for important things like healthcare, education, etc., where the government actually need to spend substantially. Government has been making statements that we will spend more, but the statements, you don't see commensurate action. So there is need for spending more on healthcare, education, which will actually lead to higher growth in the years to come.
Right. Yeah. At that point, sir, we'll have to end the show. Thank you so much for joining us on Policy Watch. That was KG Narendranath, Deputy Editor of the Financial Express. Our first story this week on Policy Watch was the dismal GDP numbers for the quarter ending March 2012. My guess, and of course a lot of other experts seem to think that the next 1 year will be really crucial for the Indian economy. Some experts say that we've hit rock bottom. bottom, some think we can only go up from here and the worst is over. We'll have to wait and watch how it plays out in the next year, which is going to be very crucial for the Indian economy. Our second story this week on Policy Watch was the National Telecom policy. Now, of course, it's just a statement of intent. Like my guest today said, the proposals have to be accepted and implemented before we can go and talk further on that. But yes, it's a policy which has the potential to, in fact, clear the telecom sector of all the cobwebs that we've been seeing for the past year or so, especially given the fact that 2G spectrum was a complete fiasco. We'll have to see where that national telecom policy takes the so-called sunshine sector of the Indian economy. As far as Pranab Mukherjee's statement regarding tax cases that won't be reopened, which was assessed before April 1, 2012, of course, that is Pranab Mukherjee, the finance minister, reaching out to investors, giving them an olive branch, saying, look, we're not the bad guys, come and invest in our country, but we will not act as a tax haven, because that's something we are not. Increase in a tax GDP ratio, of course, is very important. Like my guest, Mr. Narendranath, said, that is something the government should, in fact, concentrate on and explore for a bit. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. That's all the time we have from Policy Watch. Till next week, when we get you another guest and the week's top economic top stories. This is Athar Khan saying goodbye, and thanks for watching.